Okay, today's video is auto-rotation. So pretty important for you to understand, obviously. Why? Because if you lose your engines in an aeroplane, essentially, even if you don't really know what to do, the aircraft is probably going to glide relatively gracefully down towards the ground. In a helicopter, these things weren't really supposed to fly. So if your engines go off for whatever reason and you don't really know what to do, or don't know how to control the situation, then the thing's just going to drop like a rock. So this particular video is going to look at basic auto-rotation and also with that forces on a blade during auto-rotation. So you can get asked either of those questions, and realistically it's the same thing. And so the easiest thing to do is just combine it into one, and then you cover all the bases. So we'll start with, as always, drawings, and there's quite a lot of drawings for this one, so I'll hurry through. What we're going to do on this one is, for basic auto-rotation force on the blade, you want to just focus on vertical auto-rotation, so with no forward speed. So we'll imagine the aircraft here and here is in a high hover, it doesn't matter how high. And so starting with this one, as we know, if we're in a high hover, we're producing a load of lift, which is again giving us a nice big amount of induced flow straight through the disc. That gives us our induced flow and our relative airflow, which, as you know, gives all the various vectors off the back of that onto the aerofoil section. So we'll just add those in. So there we go, we've got our vectors, which is giving us our lift, drag, total reaction. Now importantly, we are getting a horizontal component, which is our rotor or total rotor drag, and that rotor drag is going to be offset or balanced by the two engines we've got going, or three engines or one engine, doesn't matter which one you've got, but you've got a load of engines that are going to be producing you a torque of equal and opposite magnitude. And that torque will effectively counter that drag and enable that blade to continue moving at a set speed and not accelerate or decelerate. And importantly here, we've also got our total rotor thrust, which is holding the aircraft up in the air by balancing the weight with the thrust. So what happens now if we lose our engines? So if we lose our engines, we effectively are removing our torque. So as soon as we remove the torque, all we've got left here is our rotor drag, and we've got this blade at a very inconvenient angle. Okay. And with that big angle on, all it's going to do is create a large amount of profile drag and start to basically slow down. We're no longer going to be able to continue to push against that because we've got nothing to push against, so the blade starts to slow down. So as you know, in order to counter this, as soon as we lose both our engines, what we do is we lower the collective, which reduces that pitch. Reducing the pitch reduces the profile, therefore, of the blade against the oncoming flow, and therefore we are not going to create quite as much profile drag out of it. It is still going to decelerate, but it's not going to decelerate at the same rate that it was. What is going to happen though is this great big helicopter is no longer receiving the same total rotor thrust that you were originally giving it, so it's going to start going down. So as the helicopter starts to descend, an important thing to note here is it's going to be descending into static air, and so all this static air will now start to impact the aircraft underneath and give it a relative flow of air coming up from underneath, which we call the rate of descent flow. And this rate of descent flow is going to be the same all the way along the aircraft, underneath the belly, all the way along the disc. And as you can see, now we've got a vertical flow of air, much like we did with the induced flow. This time it's acting in the opposite direction. So if we've got a blade and we've got a rotational velocity, because the blade hasn't stopped yet, we're assuming it's slowing down but it hasn't stopped yet, we've got a rate of descent flow. We can now do a similar thing and give it a relative airflow, and you can now see we've got an angle that's been made between the relative airflow and the rotational planar rotation here, the rotational speed. This angle is called the inflow angle. It's not the same as the angle of attack, because you'll note here I haven't completely feathered the blade purposely, because this little section in here is the pitch angle. And it's the pitch angle plus the inflow angle which gives us our angle of attack. So let's see what happens now then. We've got a relative airflow. We've got a 90-degree point which we're going to get our lift off. We are still going to get drag. We are still going to get a total reaction. But importantly now you can see that the horizontal component from the total reaction force has actually now come forward of the vertical axis and is acting in the opposite direction. And it is essentially no longer dragging rearwards, but it's dragging forwards. And so it's applying an acceleration to that aircraft, or applying a forward force. And it's this bit here, this horizontal component, that we call the autorotative force. So how is that actually going to help the aircraft? Well, we already said that the aircraft is descending down towards the ground. And as it descends, it picks up speed. It gets faster and faster, and as it gets faster and faster, our rate of descent flow starts to get larger and larger. As it gets larger, you can see the inflow angle, and therefore the angle of attack gets larger and larger. Aircraft is still accelerating downwards, but eventually we'll get to the point where the rate of descent flow is large enough to create an inflow angle, which is large enough to create an angle of attack, which is large enough to create a lift vector, and therefore a total reaction force vector, which is large enough to give us a total rotor thrust that is equal to the weight of the aircraft. And at that point, the aircraft will no longer continue accelerating downwards, but it will reach a steady state speed. And at that point, you're then established in autorotation, and you will neither decelerate or accelerate downwards unless you put any other control actions in, which we'll look at later. So how does that look along the blade? Because clearly we've got a blade that's moving at different speeds relative to whereabouts you are on the blade. Okay, so you'll notice I've put 3 diagrams in here. You'll see other examples where you've got 4. Don't really need to put it in. It kind of just adds extra work, which doesn't really add to anything at the end. So I've put in 3, but I have labelled 4 points. A, B, C, D, doesn't matter how you label them. Okay, so what we look at now then is the fact we already talked about that the rate of descent flow is the same for every part of the aircraft. This part, this part, this part, it's all the same. So therefore we can summarise the rate of descent flow, and for the first time ever add a little bit of scale into our vector diagrams. So if the rate of descent is the same for each section of the blade, we can just use one rate of descent flow. We know that the tip moves faster than the root, because in one rotation it's got to move all the way around a much longer distance, the entire sort of circumference of the rotor disc, as opposed to the root, which only has to move a very small distance. So therefore the tip will have a much higher rotational velocity than the root. So we can also use this diagram to give a relative representation of the rotational speed. So you can see down here at point B, we've got quite a short distance because it's a low rotational speed. We get to point C, we've got a slightly longer rotational speed, this whole vector we'll use. And then right down here, we'll use this entire line here to represent the extremely large rotational speed at point D at the tip. So with those rotational speeds and a rate of descent flow, we can also give ourselves a relative airflow. All the relative airflows will give a inflow angle, And you notice once again I've just left an ever so small amount of pitch on there, just to make it very clear that the pitch angle plus the inflow angle, it gives us an angle of attack. So let's have a look. Doesn't matter where you start from. I like to start down towards the end because that will give you a little bit more fluidity as you move up to the final stage. So looking at the tip then, perpendicular to the tip, we're going to get our lift vector. Right, so what we can see here is we've got our relative airflow, which is giving us our lift, drag, total reaction. And importantly, what we can see here is that the total reaction is acting, as we usually see it, aft of the vertical axis, and so therefore it's giving us a horizontal component which is acting aft of the vertical axis and therefore inflicting drag on that blade. Importantly though, you can also see you've got a total rotor thrust, so we're still producing a vertical component, but we are giving drag force to the rear. Let's look at the middle section then. Same again. But as you can see here, because of the size of the inflow angle, it's a little bit bigger here, it's giving us a higher angle of attack, which is going to be tilting that lift vector forwards a little bit more. And importantly here, you can see that that therefore gives us a total reaction, which has been pulled forward in comparison to this one, and is now in line with the vertical axis. Therefore, there is no horizontal component on either side of the vertical axis, but we do still have a total rotor thrust. We're still creating a rotor thrust that's going vertically, but nothing forwards or backwards. And so this one, you can see, much like this one here, we've got a clear movement of the lift vector forwards with a large angle of attack, which is giving us our total reaction long way forwards of the vertical axis, and therefore the horizontal component is now acting forwards on the blade as opposed to rearwards, so therefore it's providing a driving force. So the last bit, which we can talk about very briefly, but I haven't put the picture on them, is as you can see we've got a large inflow angle here. We talked about the fact it's giving us a large angle of attack. Now clearly as we go further forwards down towards the root, we're going to get to a point where the relative airflow is so steep that we reach an angle of attack which is close or on our critical angle of attack. As you remember, when we get to our critical angle of attack, what happens is the blade stalls. So down towards the root, we may or may not already have a section that has stalled. If it's stalled, it's neither producing lift or a forward autorotative force, and it's actually just contributing to form drag and just slowing the blade down slightly. But for now, we can just summarize where we've got to with the blade, and we can see that up on the top, we've got a nice section here which is giving a driving force, and as we get further and further towards point C, we start to move that total reaction forwards or rearwards even, until we get to a neutral point, and then we come to the rear of the blade where we are simply dragging. So all you need to do to finish this drawing off is just to annotate here dragging and driving section, and it's relatively easy to keep it simple, and you just have two sections of the wing, one part on the outside which is dragging, and then this central and root part which is essentially driving the blade around. So now we just need to look at things that can affect this. Now the first thing we talked about briefly, if the blades are going too fast, we can raise the collective. The effect that that has is that it increases the pitch on the blade, and if we increase the pitch on the blade, as you can see at each stage here, increasing the pitch adds to the already current inflow angle and increases the angle of attack. If we increase the angle of attack, then what we're going to do is we're going to get a larger lift vector all the way along, and if we look at each point in turn, we can see the effect. So first of all, at point A, we may or may not already have a stalled section, but if we increase the angle of attack here, then essentially all we're going to do is just confirm that stall. We're going to hit that critical angle of attack and we're going to stall the blade. And the same can be said between A and B. We're more likely to increase the angle of attack to the critical angle of attack and stall between here. So point A is going to start to drift this way as we start to stall more and more of the blade. At the same time, point C, we can see if we increase this angle of attack here, we're going to increase this lift vector, and also we're going to tilt this relative airflow a little bit more like this as we make the angle of attack bigger, which is going to tilt this lift vector forwards. So essentially this total reaction is now going to be acting forwards of the vertical axis and therefore giving us a driving force. So this area here, which was originally neutral, will now start to assist in driving the blade forward. And so in reality it will start to, the point C would move this way, take over this little area here, and this is the point that would now be neutral. So you can see in summary, point A would move closer to B and point C would probably move closer to D. So even though we are reducing our dragging section here and increasing a little bit more of a driving section here, this negative impact of point A, the root, gradually stalling more and more towards B, counteracts that little benefit there. And what we end up with is the blade starting to slow down. And theoretically, depending on how much pitch you put on, the blade can just start to stall down indefinitely then till it comes to a halt. The one thing you are definitely going to achieve, however, by increasing the angle of attack all the way along here, is you are going to achieve a higher total rotor thrust. So depending on how much you put in terms of pitch, you're going to increase the total rotor thrust and therefore slow the rate of descent down. So we can add this in as an overlay, and that just demonstrates what the effect is of raising the collective. What are the other things we need to look at? So weight, that's another thing that can affect your auto rotation. So if the weight of the aircraft has changed, we could get a faster or slower rate of descent. Why is that? Well, we talked about it before. So when we start to go downwards, once we've lost our engines and we've feathered the blades, the aircraft is going to drop downwards faster and faster until it hits a rate of descent flow, which is big enough to create an inflow angle, which is big enough to create a total reaction force, which is big enough to create a total rotor thrust to match the weight of the aircraft. If the weight of the aircraft has gone up, then essentially you need to get going downwards much faster in order to hit a large enough rate of descent flow to balance your weight. So higher weight means a higher rate of descent essentially. The only other thing that you might have encountered is a change in density. Slightly more complicated, but the best analogy is whether you are descending down through butter or through milk. So if the density of the air is quite high and therefore we've got lots and lots of molecules crammed into a large space, we're essentially trying to turn this rotor blade through butter, and it's a lot more resistance to it, and therefore in order to push it forwards through that butter, you're going to need a much higher horizontal component dragging it forwards. The only way we can get that is by having a larger rate of descent flow, and the only way we can get a larger rate of descent flow, as we talked about, is by having a larger weight. So if you've got high density air, then generally speaking you'll probably find you'll need to have a nice heavy aircraft in order to generate sufficient rate of descent flow to get those blades moving forwards. And then clearly the reverse applies if you've got a low density day, so on very, very hot days, or if you're very high up where the air is quite thin and you just don't have the same level of resistance, then the blade is going to spin a lot faster, and generally speaking you're going to find it a lot more lively because there's just not the same resistance dragging the blade backwards, and therefore any force you do manage to muster from your horizontal component from the total reaction is likely to speed the blade up very, very quickly. Most notable if you have a low inertia head. If you have a low inertia head, then any amount of horizontal component acting forwards can be very reactive to a low density air day and get that NR spinning up very, very quickly. So that pretty much covers it. So that's auto rotation and force on the blade. But if you cover those basic points, noting in particular the loss of the torque, leading to predominantly dragging unless you feather those blades, and then stick to those 3 main points there. You can pretty much cover the question. I hope it's been useful. As always, stick a comment in the bottom if there's anything you don't like, anything you've seen that's not correct, or any changes you'd like, then let me know. Other than that, thank you very much.